Fans of ceramic art and vintage, rejoice! After a long break, I'm back with material on such a multifaceted topic as porcelain. And this video kicks off a series of episodes about European porcelain. Let me guess, you're probably watching this video to learn more about antique and vintage European porcelain. Maybe to better navigate the selection at flea markets or antique fairs. That's why we'll take a detailed look at the manufacturing countries, factories, discuss design features, artists, and forgeries. So, pour your favorite drink into your favorite porcelain cup, and let's get started. So, European porcelain, this is a multifaceted and vast topic. European porcelain as a phenomenon has existed for more than 3 centuries. Over these 3 centuries, factories have opened, closed, reorganized, and been renamed. And not just factories. At the beginning of the 18th century, the map of Europe looked quite different. Therefore, to give us a simple and clear picture, we will proceed in chronological order according to modern countries. A bit of background. For many centuries, porcelain was an exclusive export product of China. It was transported westward by caravans along the Silk Road and by ships across seas and oceans. Porcelain literally earned the phrase white gold because it was often sold by weight in gold. Porcelain items were placed on one side of the scale and precious ingots on the other. Of course, Europeans already had ceramics. By the way, the oldest ceramic artifact in the world to date has been found on the territory of modern-day Czechia. Here it is, the Paleolithic Venus. This ceramic lady is of a venerable age, about 30,000 years old. So Europeans had been using ceramics for millennia already. But delicate, resonant, snow-white porcelain was an exotic import. Many countries came close to creating porcelain. By the way, it got its name from the Italian word porcellina, meaning seashell, because during experiments, it was believed that it was seashells that gave porcelain its exceptional qualities. In 1575, in Florence, the world was introduced to Medici porcelain. This was not yet hard porcelain, but rather soft porcelain, meaning it contained a higher proportion of glassy additives, which made it more pliable. Just look at how high the level was. Florence is the birthplace of great creators. Naturally, the themes depicted on the ceramics would also be highly artistic. For example, on this dish, there is a meticulously executed copy of Hansebald Beham's engraving King Saul commits suicide by falling on his sword. Medici porcelain appeared thanks to the enthusiasm of Duke Francesco I. He founded a ceramics workshop and achieved significant success in just 10 years. The uniqueness of Medici porcelain lies in the fact that it was made according to a formula quite different from hard Chinese porcelain, yet the potters still managed to achieve such a white, delicate ceramic body. The items were not available for public sale. Instead, they were used personally by the family and as diplomatic gifts. Today, there are about 60 pieces of Francesco Medici porcelain left in the world. For example, 6 of them, which you saw, are in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Dutch potters also tried to replicate Chinese porcelain. Around 1615, they began to cover their low-fired ceramics with a tin glaze and then a transparent one on top. By the end of the 17th century, in Delft, which remains the main pottery city of the Netherlands, more than 30 workshops were operating. Only 9 pieces of Rouen porcelain, made in the last quarter of the 17th century, have survived to this day. The technology was similar to the Dutch method. Clay vessels were coated with a white tin glaze. But still, until the beginning of the 18th century, no one in Europe was able to replicate the fine white Chinese porcelain, even though for many monarchs obtaining the recipe for this white gold was a matter of state importance. For example, Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony, was so taken with part of King Frederick I of Prussia's Chinese porcelain collection that he traded an entire regiment of 600 cavalrymen for it. The Elector got what he wanted. It was under his patronage that the recipe for porcelain was first discovered in Europe. As a result of many years of exhausting experiments carried out by the personal order of the Elector, this was accomplished by the young alchemist Johann Böttger and the scientist Tschirnhaus, as recorded in the laboratory journal on the 15th of January, 1708. In this painting, Böttger is showing his patron the results of his research. It should be noted here that a little earlier, on the path to discovering white porcelain, Böttger had managed to produce a rather high-quality biscuit. These are items made from red-brown jasper, like these. And already in 1710, in Albrechtsburg Castle in the town of Meissen, just 30 kilometers from Dresden, the first porcelain manufactory in Europe was officially opened, and it is still in operation today. Already in the first 5 years, Böttger and the artists of Meissen managed to achieve a high artistic level in their products. Take a look at this teapot from 1715. It was spotted when it was sold at a Christie's auction in 2007. Magnificent, isn't it? Both the colors and the shape. By the way, it was sold for 132,000 euros, which is 3 times higher than its estimated value. Here I've also found a few more items from the very first years of the factory's operation for you. For the first 20 years or so, Meissen imitated Chinese porcelain in its designs. These include Chavonese cranes, intricate cobalt patterns, and only starting from around the 1730s does Meissen gradually develop its own signature style. The history of the Meissen factory, its series and its artists could fill more than one episode, which I will definitely cover separately. So subscribe to my channel and keep an eye on the White Gold playlist for new additions. But today, we'll be exploring the phenomenon of European porcelain as a whole. And we have a lot of interesting things coming up. With the opening of the Meissen factory, Europe's own porcelain story begins. Speaking by country, the next territory to establish its own porcelain factory was Austria in 1718. Over the course of the 18th century, factories were opened in chronological order in Italy, France, England, Russia, Spain, Belgium, Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In France alone, by the end of the 18th century, more than 30 private manufacturers had been recorded. In the 19th century, the list of countries with their own porcelain production grew to include the Czech Republic, Portugal, Finland, Northern Ireland, and, lastly, in the 19th century, Norway, where the Porsgrunn factory was established in 1885. The last countries to join the ranks of porcelain producers in the 20th century were Switzerland and Lithuania. In 1975, with the support of Princess Grace, the Principality of Monaco established its own production, and later Romania also entered the European porcelain industry. I'm telling you this so you understand just how vast the topic of European porcelain is. In the territory of modern-day Germany, after Meissen, no new porcelain manufactories were established for more than 3 decades. It was only in 1746 that the Höchst porcelain factory was founded in Bavaria. At first, they produced faience, but by 1750, with the introduction of a new kiln, they switched to true porcelain. Following Höchst, a year later, the Nymphenburg porcelain manufactory was established near Munich. That same significant year, in the region of Lower Saxony, the truly precious white gold of the Weser was born the renowned Fürstenberg factory, which, by the way, still remarkably exists and operates to this very day, continuing its long and distinguished history. Here are some of its finest examples. The following year, in 1748, marks the beginning of one of the most famous porcelain brands in the world, Villeroy & Boch. The history of this company is fascinating and inspiring, and of course, it deserves a separate episode. Next up is the much-loved Royal Porcelain Manufactory in Berlin. However, it didn't become royal right away. Founded in 1751, it was only in 1763 that it was acquired by King Frederick II from the merchant Johann Gotzkowski. Frederick, who grew up surrounded by luxurious porcelain collections, had been passionate about porcelain since childhood, and now he had the opportunity to express himself in this field. He ordered more than 20 sets for his courts and personal use, and commissioned dozens of diplomatic gifts. Some of them you can see on your screens right now. You have to agree, these are magnificent and truly royal pieces. Antique dealers are well acquainted with the Frankenthal mark, which existed for only half a century, but that is precisely what makes it so desirable. After all, the number of items produced is limited. Take a look at them. They embody refinement, form, and decoration. In 1758, the Ludwigsburg manufactory opened its production and almost immediately found its signature, style-intricate genre sculpture. For example, take a look at these perfume bottles by the artist Johann Schmidt. Around 1766, one of the first works, but already shows a high level. These figures are complex and metaphorical. It is not surprising that these specimens are in permanent lots of the best auction houses in the world. And these are already products of the Wollendorf factory, opened in 1764 in Thuringia. That's the porcelain of 18th century Germany in short. Perhaps I forgot to mention someone, and most likely that's the case. That's why I'm sure I have the most attentive viewers who will definitely correct me in the comments. Go for it. Already in the 19th century, speaking of Germany, both Kala and Rosenthal appear. But for now, let's go back to the beginning of Europe's porcelain history, to the year 1718, when, as a result of an entire espionage operation, several masters, the keepers of porcelain secrets, were lured away from Meissen. Thus, in Austria, the second porcelain manufactory in Europe was established in the castle of Dupaquier. At first, the Austrians naturally took inspiration from Meissen's works and Chinese models. This, perhaps, is one of the earliest surviving pieces of cup for hot chocolate. It is believed that the next to establish porcelain production were the French, with their manufactories at Saint-Cloud, Chantilly, and finally Vincennes, which later became the legendary Sèvres. But it's important to understand that all these manufactories worked specifically with soft-paste porcelain-free porcelain. Hard-paste porcelain, on the other hand, began to be produced in France only from 1771, when a large deposit of kaolin was discovered near Limoges. At Saint-Cloud, the frit was made from a mixture of flax, sand and chalk, and merely imitated true Chinese porcelain. You can see the factory's products on your screens now. The manufactory operated from 1693 to 1766. The Chantilly factory, often considered the third porcelain manufacturer in Europe and established in 1730, also produced only soft-paste porcelain without using kaolin, but with ground glass and metal salts. You can now see these early pieces on your screens. This close-up shows the quality of the glaze and the purity of the color. They achieved whiteness by using calcined alum. These are crystalline salts with oxidizing properties. This method was proposed by the inventor Claude Guérin. And finally, the factory in Vincennes, established in 1740. Initially, it also worked with soft-paste porcelain, adding sand and soda. And this is interesting because, in fact, by 1712, French craftsmen already knew the recipe for Chinese porcelain thanks to the letters of the Jesuit François Xavier d'Entrecolle. No photographs or engravings of this mysterious man have survived. While in the Celestial Empire on a religious mission, the monk François Xavier studied porcelain production, Chinese medicine, and described everything he saw in his letters home. He even managed to send samples of kaolin. The letters were officially published only in 1735. But the French were unlucky with geology. Even though they knew the recipe and had their own unique aesthetic sensibility, they only found kaolin within their own country in the second half of the 18th century. And if we talk about hard kaolin porcelain, then the third factory established in Europe was a small family-run operation in Venice, Italy, which you may not have even heard of. The Vezzi family manufactory was established in 1720 and lasted for just 7 years. So where did this small family factory in Venice get its kaolin and recipe from? The official version says that among the family's partners was a certain Christoph Conrad Hunter, who had worked at the Austrian factory and even had access to Meissen. These porcelain cups, if you notice, are very reminiscent of Meissen in their artistic design. The fact that this is not just a historian's invention is confirmed by actual pieces of its production, which are kept in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the Querini Foundation in Venice. All of these pieces are made from genuine hard-paste porcelain. She is a mysterious figure. The story, as they say in such cases, is murky. But it is known that as soon as Hunter left Venice and ended his partnership with the Vezzi family, both the supply of raw materials and the production itself ceased. But for the sake of historical accuracy, we cannot fail to mention this Venetian fragment of Europe's porcelain history. And now, let's return once again to French porcelain, which is still soft-paste porcelain at this point. This is important, but we forgive them for it, because the significant stylistic influence of the French on porcelain fashion in Europe is hard to overestimate. These include entirely new serving pieces, whether it's a plat de ménage, or a surtout de table, or a compotier used for serving biscuits and sweet fruits. The French ceramic school gave the world graceful, bold new shapes for objects and new enamel colors. Here we cannot fail to mention Pompadour Pink, named after the Marquise de Pompadour, whose vibrant and flamboyant personality had a significant influence on the fashion of the time, and not just in porcelain. The French were among the first to realize that a small, repeating pattern looks very refined, and they introduced the world to their signature design, the partridge eye. Here it is on your screens. Lavender was an absolute innovation for that time. Sèvres received royal patronage and subsidies, and with them a certain monopoly on the use of decorations, such as gilding, which of course hindered the development of private production. But we'll talk about that a bit later. The best sculptors and artists were invited to work. François Lemoine, the author of the frescoes at Versailles and the vault of the Saint-Sulpice Chapel. His student, François Boucher, was one of the key French painters of the 18th century. Étienne Maurice Falconet, the creator of the Bronze Horseman. Simon Boisot, a sculptor who headed the Sèvres modeling workshop after Falconet. It was a vibrant, luxurious era of Rococo, the finest examples of which now adorn museum exhibitions and private collections. And finally, in France, near Limoges, deposits of white kaolin were discovered, and a new porcelain factory was built there as well. Limoges porcelain is distinguished by its classical shapes, hand painting, and a soft, perhaps even feminine, color palette. Shades of mint, turquoise, lilac, and light green. And despite the royal status of Sèvres, Limoges becomes the main city for porcelain production in France. With the beginning of the porcelain era in Europe, it started to be used not only for tableware, but also for other household items and interior details. Porcelain pieces could serve purely decorative purposes, like sculpture. Furniture, dressing tables, chests of drawers, and secretaries were inlaid with porcelain. Entire porcelain cabinets began to appear, such as in the Charlottenburg Palace in Germany. Here, I wanted to be a bit ironic. You might say, it's strange that this porcelain craze didn't result in a porcelain house. But actually, it did. Though not in Europe, but in the homeland of porcelain China, the Tianjin Palace. You can see it on your screens right now. Porcelain, more than anywhere else, reflected the evolution of artistic styles. For example, in 18th century Europe, the Baroque era continued to dominate. But this was only weakly reflected in porcelain, because the first pieces closely imitated Chinese originals. However, Rococo was fully expressed in both the shapes and the decoration. Take a look at these examples from Sèvres and Meissen. But by the 1750s, people were gradually growing tired of Rococo, and just a couple of decades later, it was irreversibly replaced by neoclassicism. Dinnerware sets became more restrained in their shapes and more functional. The second half of the 18th century was a time of socio-political transformation in Europe, so the atmosphere itself was not conducive to the frivolity of Rococo. With neoclassicism came the period of Romanticism, an era that lasted until the mid-19th century. Amidst the social changes, distinct stylistic movements such as Empire and Biedermeier emerged. And the second half of the 19th century was entirely dominated by realism. If we are to reflect on the processes of stylistic development in art and their influence on porcelain, then where better to do so than in Italy? Let's return to the chronology of the emergence of porcelain production in Europe. Next in line is the Italian porcelain manufactory Doccia. Although we have already mentioned the manufacturer from the Apennine Peninsula, do you remember the small family factory Vecchi with its genuine hard-paste porcelain? But that was more of an exception to the rule, since neither in France nor in Italy could they find such wonderful white kaolin as in Saxony for a long time. That is why the manufactory Doccia, which opened in 1735 near Florence and is usually called Richard Ginori, also began working with soft paste porcelain. For the first 10 years, the porcelain makers at Dokia honed their craft, and only later did they start producing goods for open sale. Here is one of the earliest surviving sculptures, Te Pieta. And this, my friends, is Florence. These are profound biblical themes, and the Dokia factory, or Richard Ginori, does not stray from these influences in its products. You can notice here that the early pieces have a grayish tint, but this does not affect the value of antique specimens in any way. An innovative development by Ginori was transfer printing, or stampina, which could be used even by inexperienced workers. By the way, fashion enthusiasts might be interested to know that today Dokia, or Richard Ginori, belongs to the fashion house Gucci. Maria of Saxony, she is on your screens, was, during those years, the wife of the King of Spain, Naples and Sicily, and truly her grandfather's granddaughter. I'll give you a couple of seconds to guess whose granddaughter she was. Of course, Maria of Saxony was the granddaughter of Elector Augustus the Strong, the founder of the exemplary very first porcelain factory in Europe, Meissen. She loved the applied arts and decided to set up her own porcelain production in her palace at Capodimonte in 1737, although the official opening date is often considered to be 1743. And since the commission was truly royal, the couple could afford to hire the best artists. Thus, in the very first years of the factory's existence, it employed Giovanni Caselli, the Brussels chemist Ottavio Scheppers, and Giuseppe Gricci. The latter became the creator of sculptures that are prized by antique collectors all over the world. Only 200 items are produced per year. So this royal amusement continued until 1759, when Charles III moved to Spanish lands and took the production with him. The factory was later revived, but as they say in such cases, that was a completely different story, which we will definitely discuss as well, but a little later. Market experts especially value the true, as they say, Capodimonte from 1743 to 1759. After all, it is very likely that these very items were touched by royal hands. I am deliberately not including the Neva porcelain manufactory, established in 1744 in St. Petersburg under Elizabeth Petrovna, in this list. There are 2 separate episodes about Russian porcelain on my channel. I've saved my favorite English porcelain for last, as a treat. It always ranks among the top 3 favorites of antique collectors, along with German and French porcelain. The porcelain history of the United Kingdom is rich in discoveries and events. Let's go over the main ones. First of all, unlike the history of German, Austrian, Italian, and French manufactories in the Old World, the first porcelain makers did not enjoy the patronage of either kings or aristocracy. Private factories developed freely. Entrepreneurs merged their businesses, bought each other out, and modernized. And from this perspective, the history of English porcelain is interesting, but a bit more complicated than in other countries. For example, the 2 oldest manufactories, Royal Worcester and Royal Derby, still argue over who was the first on English soil, just as the Minton and Copland factories continue to debate who was the first to create the famous Parian porcelaina biscuit ware that resembles creamy marble. And there are quite a few such chronological mysteries in the history of English porcelain. One thing can be said with absolute certainty. If the Saxons are credited with the European discovery of hard-paste porcelain and the creation of the very first Meissen factory, and the French with bold artistic design and the courtly elegance of decoration, then it is the English who are responsible for further modernizing the recipes and technologies. Thus, it was the English who were the first to come up with the idea of adding calcined animal bones to the mixture, creating bone china. This was done by the English ceramic artist Thomas Fry in 1748. Later, the standardization of bone china was developed, which, by the way, is still relevant today. Porcelain is considered bone china only if it contains 30% or more bone ash. Josiah Wedgwood, one of the most famous English ceramists, developed the recipe for black basalta, very beautiful porcelain body that resembles natural stone. So what else is there in terms of discoveries? I already mentioned Paris porcelain. Among the notable discoveries, Josiah Wedgwood's colored biscuit porcelain stands out. And of course, one of the main porcelain innovators was Josiah Spode, who perfected bone china and introduced the method of transfer printing in production. Josiah Spode Josiah Wedgwood, and Thomas Fry are the founding fathers of English porcelain. Their enthusiasm and dedication shaped the development of an entire industry for a long time. Write in the comments which English porcelain factories you know about and which ones you would be interested to learn more about. In the meantime, let's take a look at the finest examples of 18th century English porcelain. A list of European porcelain manufacturers would be incomplete without Denmark's Royal Copenhagen, the luxurious Hungarian Herend and Holohaza, as well as Czech producers. The Danish Royal Manufactory was founded in the last quarter of the 18th century by pharmacist Franz Müller, who was granted a 50-year monopoly on porcelain production. The first products were tableware sets for the royal family, and the design was dominated by the French style. Since the factory enjoyed royal patronage, it could afford to hire the best specialists from Meissen and Fürstenberg. Porcelain was a very fashionable diplomatic gift and of course a demonstration of achievement. That is why the King of Denmark commissioned the manufactory to create the famous Flora Danica service as a gift for the Russian Empress Catherine II. But in 1796, the Empress passed away, and the service was never completed in time. Today it can be seen in the Royal Palace and in the museum in Copenhagen. Empress Maria Feodorovna, the wife of Alexander III, was a Danish princess, and at the end of the 19th century, Danish products became very popular in Russia. Artists and sculptors from the northern country were invited to the imperial porcelain factory for an exchange of experience. That's what Danish porcelain is like. Next up is Hungary, without which the porcelain map of Europe would be incomplete. After all, some of the most famous and beloved factories are located there, Holohaza and Herend. The latter, I must admit, is one of my favorites. Just look at how exquisite these pieces are. Bohemian porcelain, or that of modern-day Czechia, is also a vast topic in itself. In the last decade of the 18th century, factories began to open here as well. One of the most famous manufactories is associated with the Thun Counts. Jan Mikoláš Weber, a court forester, began conducting experiments to create his own porcelain after retiring. Incidentally, Weber's very first work has been preserved. It is a teacup and saucer set with the inscription "Glory to Bohemia." This happened on the 18th of April, 1794. That's why the factory was named Thun 1794. Kaolin was found in Bohemia almost immediately. There were no problems with that. Gradually they honed their craft. And soon we see such luxury accounts dinners set for 40 people with gilding, for which 2.5 kilograms of pure gold were used. I tried to give you an overview of the term European porcelain, to show just how diverse the porcelain landscape of Europe is. Even the most experienced collectors admit that after working in this field for decades, they still encounter new facts every time and are constantly making small discoveries. Today, porcelain, in my personal observation, is not experiencing its best times. Unable to withstand competition from cheaper alternatives, ironically originating from the very same places where white gold was first created. All over the world, there is a trend of even the strongest, centuries-old enterprises being absorbed by commercial giants. And, essentially, genuine high-quality white porcelain, handmade at a renowned factory with history and tradition, is once again becoming a symbol of luxury and status. That's all for now. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss new episodes. See you next time!